All right, hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, welcome back to our daily e-learning lesson here for it's Tuesday, April 14th. Why don't we just go ahead and jump into our daily e-learning updates. So if we're looking at our review from yesterday, we had 47 out of 51 8th grade students who turned in their ELA attendance sheet. Or attendance form, I'm sorry. That's awesome. I have some of the journal responses included later on. That's a very high number. That's something we always like to see. Then with our Animal Farm Chapter 2 response, we had 31 out of 51 students turn that in. I looked at those maybe about 15 minutes ago. So there might have been one or two more who have turned them in. Since I actually checked, that number might be a little bit higher, but that's still a pretty good number. And if you're one of the 20 people who didn't get it turned in, obviously just please make sure that you do that as soon as possible. I will say that overall, those look pretty darn good. There were a lot of people who used not only one, but multiple examples from the story to answer their question, which is exactly what we want to be doing. And the reasoning and the explanation that people were giving was really good. So that was really good to see. And then when it came to the vocab sheet for Unit 10, which we talked about was an optional unit, only had 16 out of 51 people who turned that in. Now, I will say there were one or two people who had not, quote unquote, turned it in on Google Classroom, but I could see that they had done it, so those people are going to get credit for that. There were also, I will say, 2 or 3 people who just clicked turn in a blank sheet on Google Classroom. Maybe they just clicked it by mistake. Maybe they were just hoping I wasn't going to check. But there were some people who did that. I'm sorry to say you will not get credit for having done that if you're one of those people. So that's just how we're dealing with that. I did go through and looked at every single person's sheet in the 5 minutes leading up to this stream. So outside of someone literally submitting it at 9:59, I have it marked down who had it turned in before the 10 o'clock deadline. Those people, you're going to be getting credit for the assignment, full credit, just like I said, for all of these assignments. So 16 out of 51, not as high as I would hope, but I do appreciate the 16 people who did put that work in and get that turned in. All right, so let's talk about our class plan for today. I'll go over the Google form for attendance. We'll look at some of the writing responses you all submitted yesterday from Chapter 2 of Animal Farm. I'll give a quick preview of Chapter 3, and then if you didn't see yet, your assignment for today in Language Arts is to read Chapter 3 of Animal Farm. And then those of you who want to follow along with Vocab Unit 10, I will be going over the rest of that sheet. We'll talk about that when we get there. And actually, I'll do that after social studies, just again for the people who aren't doing Unit 10. They can stop watching, get on with the rest of their day if they would like, and then we'll do the Vocab Unit 10 at the very end. And then for social studies, we'll be talking about the key for the Part 4 video notes. Hopefully everyone got those done. And then the assignment for today is a 4-question quiz. On Part 4, there'll be plenty of hints as to what you want to keep in mind while you're going through the notes, but we'll look at that, and then hopefully everyone will be good to go with social studies. All right, so let's just look before we move on at some of the journal highlights from yesterday. The question was, what was the highlight of your weekend, the most fun thing you did, the most interesting thing? A lot of people, as you would expect, talked about either hiding or going out and looking for Easter eggs. There were a number of different people who talked about working out in the garden and the yard around the house, which is always a good thing to do, especially when you're quarantined. It's an easy way to still, socially distance, but also get outside and get some fresh air. A couple different students, it sounds like they and their families are painting one or more rooms in their house, so that was a common theme. And then a large number of people talked about going out for a walk at a forest reserve, at a park, around a neighborhood. I remember there was one student talking about she got to see some bison over the weekend, which is very cool. A student who mentioned she got to go rollerblading for the first time in a long time. A couple different students who talked about just getting to go out for a drive. And I will say it's something that, for my commute, I never really thought of that as one of the things I would look forward to. But the couple of times that I have gotten to just go out for a drive, put some music on or podcast or whatever, has been actually, something that has been enjoyable. And then just overall, people talking about getting to spend time with their families, which is always good to hear because of the circumstances that we're in. Then just some kind of goofy ones. One student talking about eating some ranch Pringles, which I believe he said are good, but they're obviously not the best flavor of Pringles. I don't recall off the top of my head if he mentioned what the best flavor was. Maybe this will be a question that we put in a future attendance form, because I feel like this is one that could stir a lot of debate. A student who talked about getting to go to Culver's, the first non-home cooked meal they had for a long time. And then a handful of students talking about getting together to play Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto. There might have been some other video games that I just forgot, but that was just a common theme as well. So just a quick update on what people did with their long weekend. But now we can just go ahead and jump into language arts and the attendance form for today. So it mentioned the only assignment for today is to read Chapter 3 of Animal Farm. Those of you who are listening along, the audiobook begins at about 34 minutes. It's about 18 minutes long, so roughly the same length as I think it was Chapter 2. And then the written version, for those of you who are just reading, starts on page 10. And then I mentioned I'm going to be previewing it, so there will just be that preview slide today. For those of you who like to have something to keep in mind while you're reading, that'll be coming up here in a little bit. Then I just mentioned we'll be going over the answers to the rest of the Vocab Unit 10 intro sheet. Again, it's optional. Even if you weren't someone who turned it in, you can still follow along, go through, fill this in, even though you won't get credit for it because it didn't get in by the 10 o'clock deadline. You can still do that, learn the word roots, and then take part in all of the review activities because, again, those are going to be optional. But as long as you're doing them, getting a certain percentage, you just get full credit. It's a good way to boost your grade up while we're in our e-learning time. And then I thought just kind of a different fun thing for some attendance responses today, kind of like a would you rather, but just some this or that questions to see where we fall. And then obviously I'll be able to report on these in tomorrow's video. So I gave you what would you rather watch, Netflix/Hulu, your streaming services, or YouTube. Would you rather spend a day in the city or out in nature? And then for breakfast, would you prefer to eat French toast, pancakes, or waffles? So, just should take about 15 seconds. Just click through those three. But again, just something fun that I thought, take attendance, another something to report back on until we get into doing some more journals and things like that. So that is your attendance form for today. So just please make sure you get that turned in to get counted for attendance. And then this was the writing response from yesterday. I'm just using some answers, or really some parts of answers that you all gave, to show what some good rationale, some good support was for this assignment. So for those of you who don't remember, we're talking about how in Chapter 2, the animals of Manor Farm chase the humans off. The animals are now in control of the farm. And the question was, in the hours after this happens, what is the animal's main goal? And I asked you to answer the question in a clearly written paragraph using specific lines from the story in your answer. So these are all from students. This is nothing that I prepared. I just literally went through, copy and pasted what you and your peers wrote. So thank you to everyone who turned it in. And some of you might be able to figure out that these are parts of your answers. I should say all of the ones that I took from, these are not their complete answers. These are just portions that I chose to include. I would say on average, the really strong answers would be about a combination of either these first two sections or the first three sections. Those of you who are looking at how long it should be or how long the really strong and well-explained answers are. So in this first section, we have a student who said that after Mr. Jones and his men are chased off, the animals destroyed everything that reminded them of Mr. Jones. that Napoleon then led them back to the store shed and served out a double ration of corn to everybody with 2 biscuits for each dog. Then they sang Beasts of England from end to end 7 times running, and after that they settled down for the night and slept as they had never slept before. They do this because they are now free from the labors of Mr. Jones. They are free to eat what they want, when they want it. They are free to sleep when they want, and for however long they want. I thought this was well explained. A great quote to use talking about animals are getting to eat more, they're getting to sleep more when and how they want. That is one of their main purposes, getting rid of the things that reminds them of humans, but then also enjoying their newfound freedom. On this next one, they start to get rid of all the things they don't like. It mentions the quote with the reins, the halters, the blinkers. Everything is thrown onto the rubbish fire, and the student said all the things they burn were things that Mr. Jones used to hurt them. That was definitely one of the animals' main focuses in the time after they take control. We had another student here, and this third one mentioned that Snowball painted out and changed the name from Manor Farm to Animal Farm. This student mentioned that they thought that the animals did this as a first act of taking over, beginning their own reign, making the land their own. And the student said, I believe a major motive for the animals was Old Major because that is what he had preached to them. Another great point, obviously one of the animals' main purposes, make the farm their own. So changing it from Manor Farm to Animal Farm. Down to this fourth one, when the men are gone, the animals feel that they should be the ones ruling the farm and that it is their job to take care of the farm, such as the harvest, and then gave the quote from Snowball saying that it is today they begin the hay harvest. The student said the animals feel that it is their responsibility to care for the farm and that since the men are gone, they now own the farm and land. I thought this was another great quote. And that leads right into this last one. Student has similar ideas, said the animals are going to try to sustain themselves. As it says in the story, they will attend to the crops. And is the quote from Napoleon saying that the harvest is more important and it's time to go out and begin. So main points that I saw a lot of people mentioning, they want to get rid of all of the kind of memories and artifacts of man. They want to enjoy some of their freedom. There were a few people who talked about going out and kind of running around the farm, looking at everything that's theirs, and also eating that extra food and things like that. And then also taking on that responsibility of making the farm their own and carrying on the business that they have, which leads into starting the harvest and doing a great job at that. So really good job for all of the people who I was reading through, seeing the responses. Again, these are just sections of the answers that your peers gave. So please don't think that just giving, 1 or 2 sentences is going to be enough to fully answer this response, because all of these were much longer than this. So that was your assignment from yesterday. Again, there were about 20 people who still needed to get that turned in. If you need to go back and add more because you're seeing me talk about this and realizing you didn't quite write enough, you can go back, add more, and then turn it back in. You will not have your grade losing credit or anything like that just because you didn't get it turned in. So then the next one we have over here is just going to be a preview of Animal Farm Chapter 3. We had done this for Chapter 2, but I just wanted to give you a one slide preview for those of you who'd like to have something in mind while you are reading, something to keep in mind, just to look out for, because it's something that's going to play a part moving forward. So I said in Chapter 3 of Animal Farm, while you're reading or listening, 2 things to look out for. How is work shared on the farm? Because remember, the last commandment of animalism is that all animals are equal. So is the work shared? It's obviously not going to be shared in terms of the amount done, just because an animal like a horse is obviously going to be able to do a whole lot more than an animal like one of the pigs or a goat or something like that. But are all of the animals pitching in, doing their part, what they can? And then also keep in mind and look out for who is beginning to lead. Because even though within animalism, The idea is that all animals are equal. You also want to keep in mind that are you seeing kind of a ruling class emerge, or is it something that's shared? If there is a ruling class, do you think that they're doing it fairly, or are they looking out for themselves? And just kind of what are your feelings about this new system that's arising on the farm? So those are two things to keep in mind while you're reading chapter 3. All right, so that's it for language arts. We will come back and do the Unit 10 vocab sheet for those of you who are following along with that. But for now, let's transition over to social studies. And so I'll give you a minute here to open up your outlines, and we can go through the key here for part 4, which you all would have done yesterday. Sorry, I should have scrolled down before I started this. That's my fault. Just wasting time. All right, here we go. So again, go ahead, open up your notes for part 4. The guiding question was, what different approaches were taken in the fight for equal rights? So we started by talking about some drama in Birmingham, and the question was, why did Dr. King and the SCLC target Birmingham to protest? And I can just say real quick, hey Molly, good to have you back. I'm hoping you're enjoying the live stream here, jumping in with Paige. I'm sure this is bringing back plenty of memories from last year in 8th grade. So why did Dr. King and the SCLC target Birmingham to protest? This was Birmingham, I'm talking about, the most segregated city left in America. So we talked about some early instances of different areas of the country being targets because they were particularly segregated, particularly violent, whatever the case might be. Birmingham at this point where we are was the most segregated city left in America. And so the next question, what would happen during this protest? Police would arrest hundreds of protesters, including Martin Luther King. King would spend 2 weeks in jail, and while he was in jail, he would write his famous letter from Birmingham jail. It's something where it's, again, one of King's most powerful writings. It's not quite up there with the I Have a Dream speech, but it's another one that just shows his feelings, and obviously the fact that he wrote it while he was in jail, that much more powerful. Another important event during this time was the March on Washington, and this would happen during President Kennedy's introduction of his Civil Rights Bill. There would be over 200,000 people who would march on Washington, D.C., and during this march, this is when Martin Luther King would give his I Have a Dream speech. So very, very important. I can tell you, I know that's one of the quiz questions during the March on Washington. That is the site for the I Have a Dream speech. So just make sure you've got that down. One of the most important and famous speeches in history. This is when it happened. We also talked in the video about the Freedom Summer. This was the name given to a period of time where in 1964, thousands of civil rights workers would organize drives to try to make sure that African Americans were registered to vote. Again, 1964, during that summer, they called it Freedom Summer because getting the right to vote, obviously seen as one of the keys to gaining more freedom for these minority groups. Another famous protest, the marches on Selma. Some of you might remember there was a movie called Selma talking about this time in the civil rights era. Very famous protest during the civil rights movement. And so the first question here, why did many protesters march from Selma to Montgomery? This was part of an offshoot of the Freedom Summer because African Americans were still being denied voting rights. And President Johnson would react by stepping in, protecting the marchers, because there were violent mobs. You know, you talk to or you hear from people who took part in these marches and that they were afraid for their lives, that they were genuinely worried that they were not going to make it to their destination. So President Johnson would protect the marchers. He would use the National Guard, law enforcement, and then he would pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we kind of mentioned a little bit in towards the end of our last section. this is a protest that would help lead to that. All right, so the Selma marches, again, very, very famous march. Martin Luther King was involved. A number of other protesters were involved. And that movie, I'll be honest, I haven't seen it, but I heard that it was really, really interesting. Then we talked a little bit about Malcolm X, because as the civil rights era moved forward, so far much of the protests had only been nonviolent. And so there were a lot of African Americans who were getting tired of how slow the change of pace was. They were getting tired of being targeted with violence from whites. And so there was a rising group led by Malcolm X who criticized this idea of trying to create a integrated society, and instead thought that African Americans should break away from whites entirely. So Malcolm X, again, he wasn't the only one. He was just kind of the leader of this movement. But he unfortunately would be assassinated on February 21st of 1965. There's a whole fascinating story behind Malcolm X. He kind of changed his viewpoints towards the end of his life. He became the target of a lot of hatred from a lot of different groups. He was a leader of the Black Muslims, and then he kind of turned his back on them, and this is what would lead to his assassination. But another very famous activist and leader from this time period, and unfortunately another one who would be killed far, far before his time. So this would give way to the Black Power movement, and this was the belief that African Americans should create their own cultural and political institutions. In other words, kind of similar to breaking apart and having a white society and a black society, that there should be black governments and just different groups and things like that that would support almost kind of like a black America and a white America. So that was the belief of the Black Power movement. Then we also talked about the Black Panthers. They were a party who demanded a number of reforms, and particularly they were opposing police opposition and the violence that law enforcement officers had been showing towards African Americans. They were one of the first groups to outwardly arm themselves during their protests. We talked about how Martin Luther King always preached nonviolent protests. The Black Panthers were the opposite of that. They were armed in their protests, but they weren't just these people who would go out and protest with guns and kind of create that sense of violence, almost like a threat. They also organized a number of things like rehab centers, self-defense classes. They provided meals for the poor. So they were very much involved in just the betterment of black society during this time as well, despite the way that they're sometimes portrayed. Not to say that they weren't armed, obviously, because they were, and not to say that they didn't take part in some violent actions, clashes and things like that, but they were not just about that as well. This time also, in 1965, there were a number of violent outbreaks that began a number of different riots. That's the section that we're under. They would go on all the way until 1967. During this time, in a lot of northern cities, such as Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, there would be riots that were usually deadly and very much destructive during this time. You might have heard the phrase long hot summer. That is the name given to this period where there were all of these riots and violent outbreaks across the country during this time. And, there have been a number of different movies, documentaries talking about it. I know that personally, my dad and my grandmother were around during this time, and they'll both talk about some of the riots that they saw in Chicago and just kind of the horror that they saw white Americans treating people of color with. Just very, very ugly times. They'll talk about people who they had lived all their lives near and didn't realize that they actually held these feelings, and then these riots would break out and they would be out in the streets yelling and shouting and throwing things at people just a really, really dangerous and destructive time in our country. So it was kind of like, this fight for rights had been going so slow, and then this was the time period where it all kind of boiled over and exploded during these riots. And then finally, the last part of the civil rights era, we talked about, unfortunately, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was shot April 4th, 1968 in Memphis. His death would also spark riots across the country and also would urge President Johnson to push the Fair Housing Act of 1968 into law as well. So two of the main leaders in the civil rights movement, just in this section alone, we talked about Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., both of whom were assassinated. So then that ends us with our guiding question: what different approaches were taken in the fight for equal rights? So we talked about some more nonviolent protests like the marches with Selma. We also talked about some groups who began to arm themselves like the Black Panthers. We talked about people who believed that instead of integrating into white society, there should be, African Americans should kind of break off like Malcolm X. So just a number of different approaches that were emerging in this fight for equal rights. All right, so that is it for part 4. We only have one more part. Part 5 is our last section of this unit on civil rights. Then we'll get to move forward on some more interesting activities where you get to dive into things a little bit deeper. But for now, that's it for your outlines, and I can just preview for you the quiz for today. So the first question, it's 4 questions, each one just 1 point each. What important event occurred during the March on Washington in 1963? I obviously kind of mentioned that already. A very famous speech you want to talk about. What was the name given to the campaign in the summer of 1964 to help African Americans register to vote? The name summer, the season is right there in the name. I can tell you it's a 2-word name, and one of them is summer. Who was the leader of the Nation of Islam who wanted African Americans to separate from whites entirely? We talked about him. He was one of the figures who got assassinated. And then finally, what happened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis in 1968, more specifically on April 4th. So if you need help on any of those, this is a locked quiz, so you'll need to make sure you know it before you go in. But I think everyone will be good to go and get full credit on this to submit for your attendance and also for this quiz. So that's the only work you have for social studies today. Take the quiz, make sure that your outlines are filled out, and then for language arts is to read chapter 3 of Animal Farm. All right, so now I'll transition back to the Unit 10 word roots intro sheet and just go over some examples from each of the word roots. So a lot of these are words that those of you who filled it out had already put in. I had said, just like normal, only needed to do the definition, one example, and one connection. And then if you're watching this, you can fill in your second and third examples for it as well. So the first word we had, ab or av, means away from. So abnormal is a word that means away from what is normal. If you are averse to something, that means you have a strong dislike for it. That means you're keeping away from it. And then absent, obviously, is a word that means you're away from or not present in a place. Second word root, sid or cis, is a word root that means to cut or to kill. So we have scissors, which is a tool that is used to cut. For those of you Grey's Anatomy fans or other medical show fans, the word incision, it's for a cut that's made into a body by a surgeon. And then decide is a word that comes from this root because it's to cut away all of your other options. So you're looking at a number of options. When you decide, you cut all of them away except for the one that you're going with. We have the word root in, im, or ear at the beginning of a word can mean not. So impossible is not possible. Irrational is not rational. Invisible, not visible. I'm sure you can think of plenty more words that just mean not by putting one of those prefixes at the beginning. Then we have ob, ok, or op at the beginning of a word, means against. So an opponent, someone who competes against another or who competes against you. Same thing with oppose or opposition. We also have the word occlude, which means to stop or close up or to stand against. And then obstacle is something that stands against or stands in your way. So those are three examples for that word root. Then we have per. Per means both through and thorough. So something that is perfect is thoroughly good. It means like it's without a flaw. It's thoroughly just exactly what it should be. Permeate means to spread throughout. And then permanent is something that lasts through time or throughout time. So those are three examples for per. We had sed or sid, which means to sit. So I went with sediment, which is the matter that sits at the bottom of a liquid. We also have residue, reside, which means to live or to be situated. It's, to sit in a place. That's where you live. That's where you reside. It's where you sit. And then the president is the person who sits at the head or at the top of a group. So it could be of a company, obviously of a country, of a meeting, is another word that uses sed or sid. And then finally we had vol or volve, which means to turn or to roll. So a revolution, a couple different meanings. It means to turn over a government if you're talking about like the American Revolution. But it also means one complete turn. So if you're ever in a car and you see the gauge that says RPMs, that's revolutions per minute, that's the number of times that the wheels are turning in 1 minute. Then we also have evolve, which means to turn into a more complex form, something you hear in science, also in a lot of other TV shows, like Pokemon and things like that. But turning into something more complex. And then we also have convoluted, which is something that is complex and difficult to follow. That means that it's exceptionally turned. Like it's turned so much that you can't even follow what is being said. All right, so those are just the words that I came up with as examples for all of these word roots. Again, I'll show here. I had gone through, if you need to pause to fill those in, and then like I had said yesterday, you can unsubmit it. I went through and tracked who turned this in already, so you all are getting credit for that, and then go through and then turn it back in once you're done. All right, so those are our 7 word roots. Nothing to do with them for today, but going forward, there will be days where I do a quizzes game or a Kahoot game for, on top of as an optional assignment that you can get credit for because you're taking the time to learn these word roots. So thank you to everyone who did fill those out. Like I said, even if you didn't, you can still take the time to learn these word roots, get on, and take part in those future review games as well. All right. So again, just one more reminder. Language arts, read chapter 3 of Animal Farm. Social studies, make sure you got those notes in, and then your 4-question quiz. As always, please do not hesitate to email me if you have any questions at all. I appreciate everyone who tuned in, or if you're watching at home later. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and I will be back again tomorrow with our e-learning video again for that day. So until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see everyone next time.